As wars continue to rage in the Middle East and in Europe, the situation on the grounds in both places continues to deteriorate, at least from the perspective of the West and the United States in particular. We're going to take a look here on this Saturday afternoon, kind of where things are as we wrap up toward the week and what we can expect in the coming week. And there's been pretty significant developments in each one of these wars toward the end of the week. And I want to kind of give you a wrap up and bring you up to date on where things are. First of all, we're going to start off in the Middle East, in the Israel-Hamas war. There was finally a big phone call between Biden and Netanyahu after a lot of pressure had been building up and a lot of messages going back and forth between various officials on either side that seemed to be talking past each other. So apparently it was time for Biden to finally get on the phone with Netanyahu. And the event that seemed to spawn all this was the horrific attack against the aid workers, the 7 aid workers that was in the Gaza Strip, just on the coastal road, which was just shocked. Even in this war, it still shocked so many people because of its methodical, meticulous precision and the fact that it hit one vehicle after another until all 7 people had been killed. Even though they had made direct coordination with the IDF, apparently they had been in communication with them during the attack and nothing seemed to help. So there was a lot of anger, and we're going to see how that's starting to permeate outside even of the official channels. But first of all, let's start off with the official channels. Following that meeting, Secretary Blinken came on to kind of give a readout to American audiences of exactly how he saw that conversation going.
He made clear the need for Israel to announce a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. He made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. He underscored as well that an immediate ceasefire is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and protect innocent civilians, and he urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home.
Now, those are pretty firm words right there. He said that he insisted on an immediate ceasefire, and he specified concrete actions. As you know, all throughout this war, one of my biggest complaints has been that we have a bunch of tough talk, but then it's never followed by actions. Then it's followed instead by Netanyahu or some of his senior cabinet members repudiating what the United States had said, repudiating what President Biden had said, and there's never any consequences for it. And in fact, we continue to give them ammunition and weapons and everything else that they've ever asked for. So tough talk, no action. So now one wonders, in light of this, is there going to be a change? Is the U.S. finally going to use its substantial leverage of being able to withhold ammunition and weapons that Israel desperately needs to continue on this operation without pause? Or is it going to be like last time? Now, it's going to take some time one way or the other to figure this out. But if there's not a ceasefire pretty quick, because the term he used was immediate, or if there's not any change in operation, and if there is continuing to give weapons and ammunition without change, then we may have our answer. But we were given a bit of a clue, kind of an odd juxtaposition, when you had these pretty strong words that the Secretary of State said that the president conveyed to Netanyahu when Biden himself was asked at the helicopter tarmac.
Did you threaten to stop military aid to Israel?
I asked them to do what they're doing.
What does that even mean? Have you threatened to withhold military ammunition and supplies? As I told you, that's the one big leverage that we have. And his answer is they're going to keep doing what they're going to keep doing. I'm hoping that he didn't understand the question or he didn't hear him right, because that doesn't make any sense. Or it says, no, I'm not going to do anything, and they'll keep doing whatever they want to do. It's really unclear what that whole exchange meant there. So again, we're going to have to wait and see. But some people aren't going to wait and see. And you have Jack Keane of the War Firster crowd. We can always count on him to misinterpret what was said or to be saying something else ought to happen. Here he is on Fox News yesterday, also talking about what happened after this this phone conversation between the two leaders. Here's his take on it.
I really think behind the motivation of the president and his team is they really want the fighting to stop. They're not saying that, but I think that's the implication of it. And that, if that happens, underscore what you just said, because if you leave multiple battalions effective in Gaza and most of the leaders effective in Gaza and the war terminates on those conditions, Hamas wins militarily in the long run. Why? Because they are effective enough to reattack at some point.
Oh my God, the war first-year general says Hamas could win the war if Biden gets his way. Except that's not what Biden said. That's not what Blinken said. That's not what any of them have actually said. Now, whether they actually hold Israel to what they have said is a very important and different point. And if they don't, then the net result is going to be pointless. But if they do what they said, that is something that is very much important and very different from the way Keane mischaracterized it intentionally. Nobody has said at any point they want the war to terminate where it is. Just blow the whistle, everybody get out of the pool, war's over, that's it, let's go home. No one has said that. What they expressly did say is that they want an immediate ceasefire for the Palestinian people. Blinken has already told everybody a couple of weeks back the blinding flash of the obvious. All 2 million people in the Gaza Strip are in desperate need of food aid. There is no internal economy. There is no way to get food independently. Every single person in that 2+ million enclave are dependent on external food. Well, we know it's not going in very well. And by the way, I don't know if you saw this, but after this phone call, Israel opened up the Ashdod port so that food could come in from there. And they open up, I believe it's called the Eris Gate in the north, which had been closed for most of the duration of the war to let food aid in. That exposes what I have been saying from the beginning, especially when all this nonsense came up about trying to build a floating pier by the U.S. Navy, is that it's always been a political decision. At any point, Israel could have opened the gates. Now they have, at least a few of them. So it looks like that, all right, Netanyahu did get some of the message. The U.S. is getting close to being serious on this, and they have taken a huge hit with all the things that they're doing, to include their attack on the Iranian general in its embassy in Syria. More on that in a minute. But this gets to show you there are those who don't want this war to end in the United States. There are those who don't want any constraints on Israel. They don't want any constraints on Netanyahu. They literally want him to be able to do anything he wants on there and then call it self-defense. You saw there was not a word anywhere in Jack Keane's comments there about the people of Palestine. No cares given. He has no interest or concern about the extraordinary, devastating human toll. One has to wonder if his family members were in that enclave, if his family members were starving to death, would he be so callous as to say, oh, we can't let them win? We'll look at that point too. If he had his way, if Keane had his way, and Netanyahu could literally do anything he wanted with no constraints and continue to get all of the ammunition and weapons from the U.S., could they win? Those, quote, final 4 battalions we keep hearing so much about in the Rafah area, if the IDF goes in there and wipes them all out, and I mean all of them, no one survived. Not a single Hamas fighter survives. Now, there's an issue about how is anyone going to know who's Hamas and who's not. We'll touch on that in a minute. But first of all, if they somehow, even theoretically, hypothetically did, then what happens next? Is the war over? Yay, we have success. We have peace for Israel? Of course not. There is going to be all kinds of insecurity built up for Israel, much more than ever was the case before. I mean, before October 7th, when there was this tension that exploded up into that terrorist attack on October 7th. The pressures that existed prior to that are nothing compared to what's already being built right now and sown in the blood of these tens of thousands of people who have died. And look, there's somewhere around 300,000 military-age males in the Rafah area right now. And allegedly, about 10, 12,000 of them are Hamas fighters. Well, what do you think about the other 280,000+ men in that area? Do you think that they're all going to just lay down and just be passive after these alleged 4 battalions are discarded? Of course not. It doesn't. You can change the title any day. No one cares. It's the resistance against this occupation and this, extreme callous behavior toward the population. Any population on the planet would react the same way. I assure you, ours would. If we were put in a situation like this and we were being bombarded, every American would stand up and do the same thing. Of course they would. It's a human issue. It's not an Arab issue. It's not a Muslim issue, a Christian issue, anything, Jewish issue. It's a human issue. And to expect this human population to react different than every other human population and culture on the globe is self-disillusional, self-defeating. So Jack Keane is wrong that we don't need an immediate ceasefire for the people. And he's wrong on the other direction. Even if he got his way, all he's doing is deepening the insecurity that's being built up for Israel. That's one of the biggest reasons why I keep harping on this kind of stuff, whether it's Netanyahu himself or the war enablers like Jack Keane. All they're doing is building insecurity for Israel. If you love Israel, if you love the Jews that live there, this is the last course of action you want them to take. But it looks like that's where they're going right now. But that's where they have been going. But it's not just President Biden. It's not just the Secretary of State. It's not even just a lot of the Democratic voters, which is probably a big part of what's pushing Biden to take these stands now. But now that it's starting to eke out even into the Democratic enablers. So MSNBC has long been seen as one of the bastions of Democratic support on the news cycle here in the United States. And when you have Morning Joe coming on and saying what I'm about to show you, this should get the attention of the White House.
It can't be said enough. Benjamin Netanyahu saw Hamas as a political ally for years. Benjamin Netanyahu was responsible for the funding of that terrorist organization for years. Benjamin Netanyahu told Qatar to give tens of millions of more dollars to Hamas weeks before the attack, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. So for those, and I've heard it read it for the past 16, 18 hours since this phone call, for those saying, oh, but what about Hamas? How could Joe Biden not talk about Hamas? Why doesn't Joe Biden see Hamas as the real enemy here? He does. But that's what separates Richard Haas, Joe Biden, from Benjamin Netanyahu. Joe Biden never saw Hamas as an ally. Benjamin Netanyahu did.
Now, for those of you who may not be aware, and a lot in America aren't, Netanyahu has spent decades keeping the Palestinians separate so that there would be no two-state solution, so that the U.S. and the West would not put pressure on him to have a two-state solution by supporting both the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strips, and from 2007 on, 2008 on. And so he has been, as I've said, this is open source information. This is not hearsay. This is not hypothetical. This is not leaked information. It's out there for anyone to see. He wanted to keep Hamas weak enough that they couldn't really couldn't take any action, but make sure they didn't fall, because it is in their charter for the destruction of Israel. And as long as that existed, he could always point to it and say, see, we can't make peace with these people, as though that somehow that they would just existed on their own and, they would come after them. If not, he kept them afloat. Just let that sink in for a second if you're not familiar with that. Benjamin Netanyahu, for a long time, I mean, multiple years, decades, was funding Hamas. A lot of it he got done through Qatar. A lot of it came through Qatar at his request. Again, open source information. So when you hear all these intelligence failures that led to the October 7th attack, that's Netanyahu's fault, because he sure didn't think that was going to happen. He didn't intend for that to happen. He wanted to keep them weak. He took his eye off the ball. He got arrogant and thought that he could keep them controlled forever, because he had been doing it for decades. And he thought he could continue on. And they, of course, shocked him and the world when that happened, but only because he tried to keep them on life support, get them enough funding to keep them in business, but not enough to be able to do what they ended up doing. So any way you want to look at it, he has a lot of blood on his hands and a lot of responsibility for what happened here. Here's the problem for America. that's starting to get us drawn into a situation where now then not just are we continuing to give our money and continuing to empty our military coffers and to further drain our arsenals, now that we could potentially get dragged into a war. So Israel has been taking a lot more provocative actions outside of the Gaza Strip. And as I've said from the outset of this, our number one priority as a nation is to keep this contained to the Gaza Strip and to get the war over as fast as possible so that the citizens and the civilians in the Gaza Strip can get back to having a life and not be killed every day, and so that the civilians in Israel can have a chance to find stability again so that nobody has to worry about getting killed from the other side. That's going to be a generational issue. Let me repeat that. But you got to start. You have to first stop the bloodshed so that you can even start that generational clock to fix things. Instead, Netanyahu has been taking more provocative actions that could have significant blowback on us. So obviously, you know, the issue with the Houthis supporting the Palestinians and now engaging ships in the Red Sea. They've actually sunk one. They still are holding some people hostage there. We're now having to spend our naval assets to patrol that, to try and keep some of that down so that the flow can continue going on through the Red Sea. We have the issue where our troops in Iraq and in Syria continue to come under harassment and are a constant threat against some of these Iran-backed militias throughout the region, both those that are associated with them and not. We've already lost 3 troops. 3 Americans have been killed expressly because of the offshoot of how Netanyahu's been prosecuting this war. And they're all still at risk today. Now then, Israel has been assassinating some of these Quds Force people and some of these Iranian leaders in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria. And on the March 28th, they actually killed a bunch of Syrian soldiers, potentially drawing them into it. And then, of course, a few days ago on March 22nd, I think it was, they attacked the embassy, the Iranian embassy, not March 22nd. They attacked the embassy of Iran in Syria. You just that breaks every international norm that exists. Nobody attacks embassies. You know, the only person that ever has attacked an embassy, Al Qaeda. They attacked our embassies in Nairobi. That's how low you have to go to find that, and that's how limited the number is. Yet Israel has done that, and now then you have the possibility that not the possibility. You have the certainty that Iran is going to respond. How they respond is yet to be seen, but based on what their leaders are saying, everybody better buckle up.
Monday's attack in Damascus is being seen as a major blow to the Guards. They've suffered 18 losses so far in Syria alone since the war on Gaza began in October. The bombing of the consulate section of the Iranian embassy in Damascus marks a new stage in what's described as a shadow war between Iran and Israel.
The
Zionist regime must know it can't achieve security by carrying out destabilizing actions. The Zionist regime will be punished. It knows what will happen and is within our reach.
Now, it's uncertain what they're going to do. There's so many options. They could go after the Israeli embassy in other Middle Eastern countries. They could go after Israel proper and hit some high value target within the Israel territory itself. They could hit an Israeli embassy elsewhere in the world, somewhere where it's less guarded. They may send suicide bombers somewhere. Or they may take out high-value targets. They may assassinate senior Israeli leaders, maybe the Minister of Defense or something of that caliber, some senior general, something equivalent with what was taken out there. Or they could do the non-kinetic one, which Dan DePetris mentioned on our show. They could restart their nuclear weapons program and openly just say they're going to go after that, which then puts everybody in a position where many people are going to start advocating for war then. We shouldn't. There's still a path out from that. More on that if it comes to it. But that's what people are going to be working for. But here's the problem right now. So we opened up this telecast today talking about how the U.S. is finally starting to get tough with Israel, how Biden is finally starting to say, hey, we're getting to the end of our rope here, and we may start using some of our leverage we have against you. You have to do a ceasefire. You have to do this. You have to stop doing that. If Iran strikes back and hit some high value Israeli target, then what I fear is very probable is that now that all of that's going to vanish and everybody is going to go right back to, oh, Israel has to defend itself. Now Israel has been the victim of Iranian aggression. I can already see the headlines. I can already promise you that the chances that, like Jack Keane and several of these others, Lindsey Graham, you can count on them saying, this unprovoked attack. I mean, I bet some of them will even use that language in describing what Iran does. This went way over the board, like there was some acceptable target that now then they violated. And of course, there is no acceptable target. If they do anything in retaliation, there will be howls of retribution. I've heard from some sources, I can't corroborate this, but I have heard from some sources that both US and UK already have target lists and target sets already identified and locked and loaded. And if Iran crosses some unknown threshold, or if the leaders of UK and the United States give the order, they can start retaliatory strikes almost right away. They've already got things loaded up in their computers ready to go. That's what I worry about. Then you have the probability and the possibility that this escalates into a big war, in a regional war, a war that we may get drawn into. And folks, I am here to tell you, if you thought the Iraq war was bad, and after 2 decades, we're still there. If you thought the Afghanistan war was there, and after how many billions of dollars that were thrown away and how we lost in that, if you thought those were bad, it's nothing compared to how bad this one could be. Iran is not Iraq. They're not the Taliban. They have a powerful missile force, with very accurate. They have a very advanced drone capability now, made much more better now because of their cooperation with Russia and their evolution and development of those systems, which were already good anyway. So there is a lot that they can do to wreak a lot of havoc there. And I'm telling you, our army, we can't, other than lob a few missiles, which we can do for a short period of time, even at a high rate, we can't sustain it. We don't have enough in our own inventories, made much worse now because we've given a lot of that to both Israel and to Ukraine. And then what are we going to do? Are we going to send in ground forces? Or are we just going to allow Ukraine or Iran to do something and then after throwing a few missiles say, okay, we're not going to do anything further? You see where the problems come in here big time. We can't go in on the ground. We can't sustain anything in the air. We can't sustain a missile attack. So we should not get into any war here at all. And especially because the only reason we're at this precipice now is because of overreaction by Israel after 10/7 and this beyond any kind of international norms attacking another country's sovereign embassy. That's the only reason we're in this position now. I will say, if that does happen and we take this foolish counteraction like I fear we will, I will come back and say, look, on this day here, on the 6th of April, we were not at war and we didn't need to be at war. There are off-ramps. There are still off-ramps. Even if Israel or Iran does something, there will be off-ramps then too. If we fail to take those and instead we take the bait, I assure you it is going to be really bad for the United States, and you're going to be putting Americans in harm's way. And if things spiral, to a certain extent, then you can have a lot of American military men coming home in body bags. And there is no reason that the only time that should ever happen is when our national security is directly threatened or attacked by a sovereign power, and our forces go into our national defense, which is supposed to be the name of it. And then it's appropriate we do that. And then if we have to sacrifice our life in defense of our country, which I did when I was serving, then so be it. That's the way it's designed. What it's not designed is for some other country to precipitate a war, drag us in, and then have our troops killed in the process when we have no interest in getting into a war with any other country at the moment. That's where we are, and that's what we're going to be watching for. And as this thing continues to evolve, and especially once we start hearing whatever Iran does, and it could come as soon as tonight, others suggest it may come at the final night of the Ramadan or shortly thereafter. So probably not very long from now, we'll be watching that, and you can count on us bringing that to you. That's your Middle Eastern update. So let's shift real quick in the time we have left here to the Europe and to the Ukraine war. And there are developments in that as well that you need to be knowing about. Toward the end of this past week, there was a meeting of NATO forces. It was the 75th anniversary of the signing of the NATO treaty. There's going to be a lot of issues with that coming up later this year. There's a meeting in Washington later this summer, in July, I believe it is, the 75th summit, which is, there are going to be a lot of celebrations with that. But there was a meeting there of a lot of the foreign ministers that met, and Jens Stoltenberg went right before the thing started to kind of lay out what the objectives of this meeting were.
We must ensure reliable and predictable security assistance to Ukraine for the long haul, so that we rely less on voluntary contributions and more on NATO commitments, less on short-term offers and more on multi-year pledges. Therefore, ministers will discuss how NATO could assume more responsibility for coordinating military equipment and training for Ukraine, anchoring this within a robust NATO framework.
So, interesting choice of words he has there. He wants the supplies for Ukraine to be less on voluntary and presumably more on obligated. And he wants a multi-year deal. And what we know from other reporting is that multi-year deal is a 5-year plan at $100 billion or 100 billion euros, I think is the denomination that they're using there. So they're wanting to say, okay, let's just perpetuate this war indefinitely. And look, there's a lot of problems I have with that. But look, that comes on the ashes of 2 years of war. It comes on the ashes of the grand offensive that they had in the Ukraine did, that was supported by NATO with such fanfare in 2023, and to complete in disaster, complete and utter failure is what that has. So you're going to build on the rubble of that, on top of the fact that Russia has regained its footing, has regained its industrial capacity, has volunteers 30 to 40,000 per month. It's crazy that they're continuing to have that kind of success. And then on the battlefield, in 5 different spots on the Eastern Front, they're making steady progress. They're inflicting extraordinary numbers of casualties on the Ukrainian troops, and by all accounts, they're getting ready to launch a new offensive somewhere in the May-June timeframe, somewhere in the north, Sumy, Kharkiv area, Kupiansk, somewhere around there, or it could even be in one of these 5 areas here. We don't know. It's a big mystery where Russia has some of their troops. They could go in any direction. Right now, no one knows. But on top of that, instead of saying, dang, everything we tried failed, and everything you want to count on how combat power is made is irrevocably in Russia's favor, and over time it's going to keep getting stronger. Instead of saying, since that's ground truth, it's time for us to put an end to this. We're going to help Ukraine maintain the line of contact, and we'll give them every diplomatic support that we can to try and find the best negotiated settlement that gives them the best deal and the most freedom going forward, so that they can end the war and start rebuilding their country, and stop shoveling their young people, young men especially, into these meat grinders, which have no value to their country, because they're going to need those people to rebuild. That's what we should do. And instead, what are we doing? More of the same. Instead, we're just going to be blind and say, well, that didn't happen. All those failures didn't happen. All of the stuff that Russia's doing, the improvements, they're not real. That's not really happening. Like, they can just get their calendars out and start planning out, all right, let's go 2025, then we'll do this in 2026, and then by 2028, like it's some business meeting or something, that you can do the 5-year plan. It's just detached from reality. It's crazy, some of the things that they're doing here. But that's the reason why Stoltenberg can say that, is because other senior leaders in Europe say that. And I believe it was a couple of days ago, you had the foreign minister, the former prime minister of Britain, Cameron, say this.
What we face today is as simple as then. We have a tyrant in Europe who's trying to redraw borders by force, and there are 2 choices. You can appease that approach, or you can confront that approach. It is undoubtedly the right thing to confront it, and that is what we're doing by giving Ukraine such strong support.
So it's ironic that he's saying that he doesn't want to appease Russia, and that he wants to keep going, like Stoltenberg said. They probably had conferred on that. But it's a little bit ironic that he's talking about the reason why he was saying the context there before he spoke was that just like World War II started, that's where we are here, and appeasement led to that. So it's almost like Prime Minister Chamberlain, the famously waving that paper around that we have peace in our time, right before Hitler, took the appeasement and started marching across Poland. He's trying to almost making up into doing the exact opposite. In this case, ending the war is exactly what you need to do. It's not appeasement. That's the wrong term to use. It's not even accurate in any context. What is accurate is recognition of ground truth reality and making logical, rational, sober policies that have a good probability of succeeding and prevailing for security for your side. That's what is wise. That's what wise action would be. The foolish action is going to be to ignore all of that and the trying to make good somehow. You have another British leader, another former prime minister trying to not appease and doing the exact opposite. He's compounding Britain's problems. Not going to work out very well. And in fact, he's not stopping there. In Politico reported, I think on Friday, that he's so upset that the U.S. hasn't given that $60 billion that he's telling all of his colleagues in Europe to put pressure on the U.S. Speaker of the House. That's just, you talk about interfering in the inner politics of another country. I've not seen a sitting member of another government tell his colleagues to put pressure on an American official in our parliament that's to say, hey, stop doing whatever you're doing for your country. Stop having the issues debated between your parties and in the two chambers of your Congress. Do what we tell you. I don't think that's going to go over well. So if he thinks that that's going to put pressure on Johnson to actually move, I think he's going to be surprised to find that it's probably the opposite, because he's not going to do that. And nor should he. But unfortunately, he's not alone in that. So it's not just the Europeans. It's also the White House is trying to put pressure on Johnson. And KJP, the spokesman for the White House, has said this about that issue about Johnson. But she says something else here I want to point out.
We've been pretty consistent about this when it comes to the National Security Supplemental, that it includes all important Ukrainian aid. We believe that there continues to be bipartisan support in Congress. The Speaker needs to put that on the floor. He needs to make sure that he gives House members an opportunity to vote for that. We believe it would get overwhelming support. And we have to remember, there are lives at stake. There are lives at stake here in Ukraine. The brave people of Ukraine need the assistance from the U.S. to continue to fight for their democracy. That's what we've been able to do for more than 2 years. We've got to continue that. And because of congressional inaction, we have sadly seen Ukrainians losing ground in the battlefield.
So because of congressional inaction, we've seen the Ukraine side lose ground. So KJP, and ergo the White House, is directly putting the blame at the feet of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, that it's your fault that Ukraine's losing the war. No, it was not Johnson's fault that they failed in their summer offensive because they had a bad plan and it was executed poorly on top of that it never had a chance, and that everyone ignored all the realities at that time. And now then the battlefield was soaked with the blood of Ukrainian men because of that failure. It's so ironic, if not perverse, that she makes that breathless comment that people's lives are at stake. We have to remember that. Indeed, they are at stake. And look, I am a big advocate for Ukraine. I know many people don't think that's the case. They actually think it's the opposite. No, I'm for Ukraine keeping every meter of territory they've got today. The sooner you can get to a negotiated settlement, the more of that terrain you're going to keep. The fewer of your soldiers are going to be killed. The less of your cities that are going to get wiped off the map. If you care about Ukraine and their people, you should be the first one lobbying for a negotiated settlement, not just saying the Congress needs to give $60 billion. The other thing she's not aware of is what that money even does. She's not a military expert. I don't guess we should expect her to be, but whoever gives her the talking points certainly should be. And when you understand that money is going to buy us, we had Mark Kansian on from CSIS this past week that talked about some of that money, and only a small portion of it's actually going to go to Ukraine. a large portion of it's going to go to backfill to build more artillery shells, some of which will stay in the U.S. inventories, some of which will go forward. But it's only a relatively small portion. So all you're talking about mainly is some number of artillery shells, which, of course, every shell would help on their side. It would redress some of the imbalance, but only some of it, and only temporarily. I mean, it would make it go from its current like this to maybe like this for a short period of time. And, of course, it's going to take, as Mark pointed out, that contracts that are signed now, you're talking a year or two before they actually get turned into anything. Now, of course, these guys here, these Lockheed Martin types, General Dynamics, they don't care about that. All they care about is the fact that when the contracts are signed, they get paid. They get money up front. So they do succeed here, but the people on the ground in Ukraine don't. So even if this money gets passed, it's not going to result in anything on the ground, any kind of tactical change, because that's not how combat works. One other thing she didn't say anything about here, which I want to make sure everybody is aware of. You heard Stoltenberg at the top of this section here talking about how they want to go on a multi-year program. It's a 5-year program. So it's $100 billion in Europe. What portion of that is for the United States? So because that's only about $20 billion a year they're talking about, which is enough to keep the state running, basically. So they need that just to keep the government workers paid, the trains running, all that, because they basically don't have any national income. Their economy has just been gutted. So they need just operating capital on top of what they need, for war material and efforts. KJP here is talking about $60 billion. What is that going to be good for? Probably the rest of this fiscal year, maybe all the way to the end of the year. But they're already talking about building for 2025. Well, what do you think is going to happen in 2025? How's that going to be funded? Where's that money coming from? Your pocket. Because you can count on, for a fact, some number of months from now, if Johnson does give into this pressure and they do pass this, let's just say they get the full $60 billion they've been asking for, how long do you think it's going to be before the next round comes? And it won't be 60. It'll probably be around 100 billion, because then if they have any prayer of going on an offensive, if they even think they want to do that, they're going to be thousands of more armored vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, air defense systems, armored personnel carriers, and the like, on top of all the ammunition and the other kit that is necessary to conduct and sustain war these days. Where's that going to come from? You can't make that real fast. That stuff takes years to produce. So that means they're going to have to take it out of existing inventory, further weaken our capacity, further lower our inventories, or us or our allies. But that's coming from somewhere. And even if you take existing stuff, it's got to be paid for, which means more money has to be allocated. You see where this is going. And if you don't, let me paint a very vivid picture. Just like Afghanistan, it wasn't one passage. It's year after year after year. If the Ukraine army doesn't buckle, and I think that there's a greater chance than many people are aware of that they could buckle before the end of the year, which could make all this mute. But if they don't, if they somehow manage to hang on, and if they didn't collapse and it did go in multiple years, that means that they're going to keep coming to you year after year, go back. Here's what's missing. And here's one of my biggest complaints about the White House and in fact, the whole U.S. government and all these war firsters like Keane and everybody else. There is no strategy. There is no objective. It's not like the U.S. wants to accomplish this. We're going to go to this place. It's going to cost us this much. We think that we project it to take this long. And here are the resources we have. And here is the path and the strategy why we think this is a rational plan. Here's how we're going to know if it succeeds. And here's how it will end. Here's what the end looks like. You at least have a concept. The final objective looks like this. Once you have those things annotated, now then you can move here and there. You can start setting up things and you can say, all right, this money makes sure, and here's the process on that. Here are the metrics. So we see if we're succeeding. If the U.S. government is going to take your money out of your pocket and give it to another country, the very least they could do is to tell you what the plan is. And here's how you're going to know if it's successful. Maybe you think it's a good idea. Once they lay the plan out and said, here's how much it's going to cost, here's how long it's going to take, and here's the end result, which we think will be in America's vital national interest. If they want to make that argument and they can lay that stuff out and convince you, then fine. Even if I disagree with it, they've done it, and the American people agree with it, and I concede to the American people. But they haven't done that, and they're intentionally not telling you that while they are taking dollar bills out of your wallet. I don't like that. And especially when those dollar bills are doing nothing and there's no prospect for them to succeed, especially given that you didn't give them prior approval to do it. But they're trying to commit that before they even gather up the taxes. That's one of the biggest problems that we have in our arsenal here. And just because Secretary Blinken can't leave well enough alone. So all the things I've told you about, how things are going poorly, there's no plan, there's no prospect. Even if you look at the resources, you look at the other side, you look at things in balance. Even after all that, instead of just leaving well enough alone and keeping quiet, Blinken has to throw a little bit more kerosene on the Russian fire.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. We will see, I think, in the summit, very strong support for Ukraine going forward in its relationship with NATO.
Yeah, we're going to see strong support for Ukraine in NATO. The very thing that spawned this war, the primary cause of the war, was NATO in Ukraine on Russia's border. Putin's been saying it since 2007. He's been repeating it nearly every year since. He was saying it all up in the lead up to the war because he doesn't want NATO missiles and forces right up onto his border. And especially if you look at a map and you see how Ukraine juts into Russia, it's not like even the Baltics. Even though the Baltics border Russia, the terrain there is very constrictive. So if any force ever tried to actually invade Russia from there, Russia has all the advantages and they can take care of that. In the Ukraine, though, if there were to be a NATO advance in the middle of Ukraine, it's wide open and there's no natural barriers. And Russia would be very, very vulnerable, which, of course, they do look at the map. And so that's why they've been so motivated and animated to continue to do these things. So now, instead of talking about a negotiated settlement, we just want to throw more gasoline on the Russian fire and say, nope, they are still coming into NATO. Folks, let me just tell you as plainly as I can, Ukraine will never be in NATO. They won't qualify for it. Then you have to have unanimity among NATO countries, and there is no chance in God's earth that all those countries are going to vote to have them in there because they see these decades of instability between Russia and Ukraine. They have just even a minimal understanding of history so that whenever this thing is resolved, however it's resolved, the anger and the animosity and the hatred between the two sides is going to continue to fester, meaning that in time, there's going to continue to be the risk of war. Now, why would anyone want to sign up to be the guarantor of an unstable regime that has existing high degree of animosity to their border and the possibility of future conflict that has nothing to do with you? But if they get into it, you're going to get drawn into it and maybe receive missiles on your territory, have your soldiers killed, and in a worst case scenario, advances to nuclear warfare. And you get cities evaporated. That's not an unreasonable possibility. And I assure you, for all the rhetorical support for Ukraine, there is many countries in NATO, Hungary and Slovakia, to name two right off the top. You could probably add Turkey into that as well. They're never going to agree to that. But they think the whole thing is dumb. You've had Viktor Orban from Hungary has been saying for well over a year the same things I'm telling you right now. War can't be won. Let's find a negotiated settlement. That's what he wants to do, not to escalate. There is no way that they would ever agree to something suicidal as adding an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine. So whatever you hear Blinken saying there, it's complete untrue. There's no chance he believes it. I can only speculate why he would say something that he knows to be untrue, and I won't bother because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what his reasons are. They're dumb. And it harms the situation because it just makes it easy for Putin to continue to keep support on his side and among his population saying, see what I told you? They're coming after us. And this has always been about to build security against us. And they want to come up to our border. All those things that he tells his people to keep them supporting, that just makes it easy. Because I guarantee you that clip's probably playing all over Russian media, and they continue to put it out there to say this is why we're fighting and why we have to continue on until we win. You know what the bottom line is? You know what the greater result for this, whatever Blinken may in his mind think about spin, whatever, is it's more likely to create the conditions that Russia will not just come with a negotiated settlement that's not in terms that Kiev would like, but in a military victory, even if it takes them another year to do it. I think that there's an increasing chance that the Ukraine army somewhere along this line is going to buckle before the summer's over. Don't have a crystal ball, but just looking at what I do, what I can see, and what I know about how combat operations work, and the study I've done from wars over centuries and how humans react under those kind of conditions, everything tells me that things are continuing to deteriorate for the Ukraine side. So even if it takes the years, though, they don't buckle now, Russia is steadfast. They are going to keep going on, even if it's just methodical, meter by meter and village by village, and until eventually they capture all the way up to the Dnieper River. And then they offer Kiev terms of surrender. That's the more likely outcome, not that Ukraine gets in NATO, but that more of Ukraine goes to Moscow. Let that sink in for a second. Our actions are more likely to result in the loss of more Ukrainian territory for Putin than the other way around. And then the fantasy that somehow we're going to end up winning this, that we're not going to. And it's just hard for me to fathom how long we can keep going with this fantasy when all the things on the ground, the reality, the ground truth that we talk so much about is continuing to move to the west. I guess we're going to have to wait and see. You can count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to keep bringing you the truth and the reality, no matter what some of our politicians say, no matter how they spin things on television. You're going to come here and you're going to get the truth, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised, because that's what's right. And that's what you deserve. Thank you for joining us today. We ask you to like and subscribe. Folks, do not miss next week. We have a great lineup. We have Jason Beardsley coming back, Doug McGregor, the great John Mearsheimer. I mean, we've got some great folks, and some others are coming back too. Colonel Jacques Baud, one of our new favorites, is going to be on. Really a tremendous lineup coming in next week. Just keep on watching this channel for when the start times come, and we will see you next week on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.